Welcome to What Moves You, a Speedway Motors podcast for people who love cars. I'm Joe McCullough, and today we're going to hear all about the Museum of American Speed from curator Tim Matthews. We'll talk about new exhibits in the museum, including a bunch of new drag cars, and the A.J. Watson garage that they basically picked up and moved right into the museum. We'll check in on Tim's Hemi-powered Model A that he's building at home, and hear what it's like to drive around in Dick Landy's altered wheelbase Dodge. So you're actually in the museum, you know, with all of us working from home with all of this weirdness that's going on. It must be good to get out of the house and actually get back to the museum.
Yeah, you know, it's not the same place. Obviously, we enjoy the museum a lot more when we have visitors, people coming from all over the place, and, you know, our wonderful staff. And we have a group of 50 volunteers. They're all hardcore car people. The staff that is very passionate about the museum. I mean, without the people, the museum isn't quite the same, but it is nice to get in here and kind of make sure all the tires are aired up and everything's dusted. So when we're ready to reopen, we can do so in style and accept everybody back. It'll be a lot of fun.
Not everybody is familiar with the museum. Not everybody understands what Speedy Bill created. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? How the museum got started?
Yeah, I think it's a fun story, and it's really at the heart of what we do. Bill Smith was truly a passionate car person, and his wife Joyce was a huge support in that. Bill, from the time he started working on a Model T, as a teenager, he was finding parts that he thought were interesting, speed parts that could make his Model T work a little bit better, go a little faster. And he started learning about some of these engineers, like Robert Roof, and he started ferreting away all these parts that he thought were just neat. Now we have a museum that's 155,000 square feet. It's 3 stories tall. We have all types of vehicles in here. I mean, it's not your typical car museum where everything's parked door handle to door handle, and there really is no soul or story. We try to find vehicles that, made a difference in the history, in automotive history, and we try to tell their story well. So they're not jam-packed door to door, that we're giving them enough space that they have a good story to tell and a great display.
Yeah, there's something about that place. You walk in and you just instantly get a shot of soul. You just can't help but feel it. It's like all the things in there are vibrating.
If you've walked next to a car at a drag strip, when it's running, it's in the staging lanes. That's a feeling that you get. That I think sticks with you. But it's different in the museum because so many of these cars are on display and it's very quiet, but you still get that same feeling of exuberance and reverence. I think it's because of the human story with so many of these vehicles. It's cars that have such great histories, and it's all about the people that were involved with them. And I think that's what makes the museum such a special place, is that we can tell those stories.
The Landy Dodge, that is a pretty famous car. And one of my all-time now favorite Speedway memories is gathering in the front conference room for a meeting of one sort or another and hearing just this gnarly open header racket out in the parking lot. Like, what in the world is that? And so, of course, Speedway, everybody who's in the meeting is a gearhead. Everybody sprints out the front door to try to figure out what it was. And here's Tim lapping the parking lot in this altered wheelbase, straight axle, Hemi, open header, Landy Dodge. Like, holy moly, that's the kind of thing that could only happen here.
There are certain things you do thinking, I might get in trouble, but it's worth the risk. That was a funny day. We were wanting to bring in a special car, something that told the story about factory involvement in drag racing, something that told the story of Dick Landy, because we had some other vehicles in the museum that kind of have some of Dick Landy's fingerprints on them. So we wanted a car that kind of helped us tell that story. So if it could have a Hemi, great. If it could be an altered wheelbase, great. If it had an aluminum front end and acid dip bumpers, great. If it could be the first altered wheelbase car, that would be great. You could make the argument that it was the first funny car. Some people, might go back to the high and mighty Ramchargers car to say maybe that was the first funny car. But this one makes a pretty strong argument for being the first funny car. Well, when I found out it was coming to the museum, I got very emotional about it. I remember Clay Smith and I were on a phone call, and I was so happy. I think I called every single one of my relatives. They were like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, no, this is a big deal. I was really excited. And so when the hauler showed up with that particular car, it was on the upper deck of the semi trailer, and it was way at the end, and it was cold out. I'll never forget. It was kind of a chilly day. And the hauler driver said, "This thing runs, but it doesn't have good brakes, and I'm not driving it." And I said, "Well, that's fine. We could push it off, and try to, ease it off onto this crazy, you drive it out on the tailgate of the semi, and then that hydraulically lowers. And, this is a over 3,000 pound car. It's probably pushing about 35. Well, with all the aluminum parts, it's probably closer to about 3,100, I'm guessing. So it's a big beast of a car. It has a straight axle with no front brakes. And it's a full race Dick Landy 426 Hemi with a big nasty cross ram and all that. So I decided that we'd just push it. That was probably the safest thing to do. And sadly, the thing was not pushing. I mean, it just did not want to move. I don't know if it had some brake issues. So I hopped in, and the pedal was really super stiff, and I was just scared to death. And finally we decided, let's try to start it and just see if we can ease it back, and there is no easing back a 426 Hemi. I mean, it's just it's just a monster. So we get this thing fired up. Everybody's plugging their ears, and it's so loud. I have a smile, from ear to ear. I mean, it's the coolest thing ever. And everyone agreed that no one wanted to risk driving it, so I was kind of the guy that had to try it. So I eased it out. The brakes were super sketchy. I get it out on the tailgate of the semi and way up in the air. There's no chocks to stop it. The guy's just like, guiding me back. And so by the time that thing hit the turf, I was so happy and relieved that we got it off the semi. I decided I need to take a celebratory drive around the parking lot, and it was worth every minute. It was probably some of the greatest time I've ever had at the museum. It was just an amazing car, and so much history. And I thought about Dick Landy smoking a stogie driving that thing. I thought about his sons working at the engine company that has done so many fabulous Hemis for people around the world, and just such a cool car, such cool history. And I had a chance to drive it. Probably the only time in my life I'll get a chance to drive that particular car. And now it's here at the museum on display for people to enjoy. It's really cool.
And that car was the first year of the 426 Hemi, the first year of the street Hemi, or I guess in that car it was a race Hemi.
Yeah.
And that was one of the very first factory Hemi cars.
Yeah, it was. That particular car was the first 426 Hemi to win a sanctioned drag race, which is pretty fabulous. That was about the same time things were ramping up at NASCAR, and they were using the Hemi in NASCAR, and Chrysler was obviously very proud of the Hemi, so they wanted to make sure that it had some exposure and have some positive press. So they were really trying to get that engine in the hands of some people that they knew could do good things with it. People like Richard Petty and Dick Landy and a lot of other folks. So.
And we have to talk about Ramcharger's funny car with the top flipped up. Where did that come from?
That car is really amazing. It is a very pure car from the 70s. It's one of the last of the Ramchargers team cars. The Ramchargers really got started early on when they built the car that known as the High and Mighty, and they were very experimental, with long ram tubes for their intake manifolds, crazy exhaust, moving the engine way back in the car for traction, and they did a lot of amazing things. And then that just carried on, through drag racing into the super stock era when they were, doing a lot of things with factory lightweights and racing in the super stock classes. And they got involved in top fuel cars, and they also got involved in funny cars. And the car over my shoulder is a car that was brought to the museum by a great guy named Jim Matuszak. And Jim is not only a drag racer with some great history himself, he's a great student and restorer of cars that are significant. And he always loved the Ramchargers team, being from the Detroit area, Michigan area. This car was a pretty important piece. The Ramchargers team was pretty important. So he really felt that when it came time for him to part ways with this car, a car incidentally that he restored, using as many original parts as he could. I mean, that body has the battle scars underneath it to prove that it's hit the guardrail a few times. You never know by looking at the outside because it's an absolute gorgeous sculpture. But he felt that rather than it take some kind of a circuit on the vintage racing scene, he'd rather have it be in the museum where we could tell the Ramcharger story. And to Jim's credit, the guy knows how to restore a car. This thing is just absolutely amazing, and it has the Ramchargers team's fingerprints all over it. I mean, it's all the special parts that they built for that car, all the red anodized tin work. It's just fabulous. That car, as a matter of fact, speaking of red anodized parts, it has red anodized connecting rods in it. And when they'd pull the motor apart, people would say, "Holy crap! Why do you anodize your connecting rods?" Thinking that it was because if some benefit like the oil falls off them faster, but it was actually just because they look cool. I mean, that's the only reason they did it. Jim did an amazing job restoring the car. It's beautiful, and Jim and his wife Julie took a lot of pride in that car. They call it their baby, and when they had to find a final resting place for it because they were moving back into doing some farming and things of that sort, they decided this would be the best place for it. And I'm just so glad because it's a really cool piece.
What year was that car campaigned, or years?
That's between 1970 and 71.
Okay.
So kind of right toward the time where funny cars were getting sorted out, with the flip tops and all of that. And you realize when you're around those cars, it's amazing how fast they go. It's amazing how violent they are, but it's amazing how fragile they are too. Like when you lift up the body, there are only certain places you can touch it, because you want to make sure you don't hurt anything. So it's kind of like this butterfly, but at the same time, you imagine that thing screaming down the track, at a couple 100 miles an hour, just insane.
And you have a pretty cool, as the collection accumulates more and more drag cars, you have a pretty cool sort of bookends on the 60s funny car era. You have Landy's altered wheelbase Dodge, which is, arguably the first funny car. And then you have, that was only 5-6 years later. You look at what it evolved into, they were all floppers, they were all flip top cars. That's the kind of story that you can really only see from start to finish in a place like the museum.
Yeah, and I think, it's amazing how many areas of the museum there are that really focus on the 60s and just how much changed in the 60s. It was not only with drag racing, but with dirt track racing. And you see Bill Smith's 32 Ford that he used to race locally, and then 10 years later, the mechanical rabbit that's on display, and just how different that car looks. It looks like a spaceship, compared to what, 10 years earlier they were racing. Indy cars no different. You go from really skinny tires, front engine, to this crazy, when the European influence came, and you have a 1970, Johnny Lightning Special, which looks like an airplane with no wings. I mean, it's just crazy. So drag racing's no exception. I mean, that decade, there was so much going on, and things were changing so fast. The car that you brought to the track one weekend would be obsolete the next weekend, and I can't even imagine what that would have been like.
You and I are going to have to do this again, because you have now, just in the last 30 seconds, alluded to all of these other places in the museum. There is an IndyCar display. That Johnny Lightning car is sitting there. You could look at it. The Parnelli Jones and Al Unser drove it. And, there's the Miller, there's a whole room full of Miller engines. We're going to have to, you and I have been talking about drag cars, but we're going to have to do this again and talk about a lot of the other stuff.
Oh, absolutely. We could go on and on talking about flathead engines and all the crazy, history there, and all the intakes, and all the development there. That you could talk about all the overhead cam or overhead valve conversions, for those engines. It goes on and on. Matter of fact, my wife, she'll sometimes, give me a lot of heartache because I forget my niece's birth dates and things like that. And the reason is because I'm having to remember so much about so many different eras and so many different types of racing. And, for, a pretty humble guy from South Dakota, I'm just not sure my brain's big enough to hold all that information. It's just a lot of stuff, but it's definitely humbling, and it's a definitely great history. And you're right. You could pick any area of the museum and talk for an hour about it because there's just so much going on. We've done a lot of really great displays, for different areas, one of which is the A.J. Watson display that we did up in the open wheel gallery. And A.J. Watson obviously was a really important figure in IndyCar racing. He ushered in the roadster era with the design of car that he brought to Indy. Here's a guy that was really a hot rodder in California that decided, he was good enough to build a car to go racing at Indy. And then, he became kind of the dominant car builder. And so what a fun project it was to be able to take his garage. When he passed away, he left all of his tools and equipment and, supertanium bolts and offie parts. And we were able to take all of that stuff and bring it here and create a display for it just the way he left it, and to be able to tell his story. So if you're an A.J. Watson fan, there's another area of the museum you should probably check out. It's just every corner of this place has a cool story, which makes it a lot of fun.
Do you want to talk about how Cars and Coffee came to be?
Yeah, it's kind of a fun story. When I first came to the museum, we were not open on Saturdays. We were kind of a Monday through Friday type of affair. But it dawned on me that being open on Saturdays made sense because being a working guy myself, Saturdays were the time to get my kids out and go do fun things. So we decided to open the museum up on Saturdays from 9 to 1. And I'll never forget our very first Saturday being open. It was myself, a fellow named Jerry Topol, and I believe a guy named Dave Ellison was here too, if I remember right. And I'll never forget, because people didn't know that we were open yet, no one came to the museum that Saturday. And I thought, boy, this is a brilliant idea. What are we doing? And Jerry Topol, who is an ex-submariner in the Navy, cool guy, has an old Plymouth, and he's one of our restoration techs here at the museum. I wish he was my uncle. He's just such a neat guy. He had his hot rod here, and I said, Jerry, why don't you bring your car around front and park it by the entrance so we have something to look at and something to talk about, because this is going to be a really boring day dusting cars, and so he did. And then Dave had his Corvette here, and I said, well, bring your Corvette around, and let's park that up front too, and maybe it'll draw some attention. So here we are all sitting on the front step looking at these cars, and then Clay Smith drives up and he's like, hey, we got a couple of people in the museum with cool cars today. And we had to admit to Clay, actually we don't have anyone in the museum today. It's Saturday, and I don't think anybody realizes we're open. So we were all sitting there, and I think it was Clay that said, wouldn't it be cool if we just invited people to bring their cool cars out to the museum one Saturday, and we'll give them some donuts or something. And I said, geez, brilliant idea. He said, Tim, make it happen. Well, as you know, no person is an island. You don't do these things by yourself. So I got in touch with Alana over at Speedway Motors and told her kind of what our idea was. And between all of us, we worked it out that, yes, we were going to let people come to Speedway Motors campus the last Saturday of every month through the warm weather months. And if they came and brought a cool car, they'd get free donuts and coffee and a ticket to come into the museum. And, we thought, boy, if we get 6 or 7 cars, that'd be great. I mean, that'd be better than looking at the same Plymouth, every weekend. So so it worked out wonderfully. Obviously news traveled fast, and I think Lincoln, Nebraska was kind of hungry for an event. And I think what really makes Cars and Coffee cool, it's not really the donuts, it's not really the free coffee, although those are cool elements of it.
Yeah, please don't discontinue those.
Yeah. I mean, really, that's what brings all of our kids out, right?
That's why I'm there.
What makes it great is it's early in the morning, so you can come out, get your car fixed, and still get all the things done on your weekend that you need to do. It's not judged. If you hate 50s music, you don't have to worry. We're not going to play, anything from Chuck Berry. And we're not going to play any music. So we keep it kind of laid back. We don't give out awards or any of that monkey business. So it's just about bringing out your car and seeing your friends, people that care about cars the same way you do.
It seems like anymore you're a car person. You have equal respect for, and of course you have your favorites. You and I like traditional hot rods, but I dream to have a Porsche parked next to my Model A someday, or you're you have a muscle car and you also have a Fiat, I mean, you just Jim White has a Morris Minor that sits in the garage next to his LT1 powered Nova. That's what I think is so cool about Cars and Coffee, is that it sort of shows that. And you're not parked, you're not, you're driving a Turbo Civic, you have to go park next to that guy with a Supra. It's everybody just settles in, and there aren't any walls put up to keep people separate from each other, and it's just so cool. It's like a little car utopia for 3 hours on Saturday morning.
Yeah, and we're good friends with Bob Larrabee here at the museum, and he of course was the guy behind all the Detroit Autoramas, and so as Cars and Coffee has evolved, I'd be an awful manager if I didn't think of ways we could make it better, right? So I've always, wondered, geez, do I need to do like Bob Larrabee and, have, Lou Ferrigno come out, or a BMX stunt show, or, do I have to have like these other attractions to keep people coming? But so far it's been great, because just the friendships and the camaraderie and the other cars that show up kind of keep it going and keep it strong. And I hope anybody that's listening out there that hasn't been to a Cars and Coffee will tune into our schedule and come out, even if it's as a spectator, to enjoy it, because we're really trying to make it an event for you. We don't really benefit from it in any way other than being able to see what people are working on. And, that means something to us. We like to see what people are interested in, as you alluded to, Joe. And we just would invite you to come out. If you don't think your car's cool enough, I would argue that it probably is. I mean, there's nothing, off limits. And we had a tractor show up, at one of our Cars and Coffees. So, we've expanded it. I joke around about the first few where you and I could sit under a pine tree and just kind of chill. That does not happen anymore for me. Now we have guest speakers. We try to invite somebody that's really interesting to come and kind of tell their story. So as part of Cars and Coffee, you can come into the museum and sit down and have a history lesson about somebody that might inspire you, or has certainly inspired us.
You mentioned the guest speaker thing. That for me has been, I'm just a nobody. I'm just a welder basically. But I got to meet Al Teague. Like these guys that come in to talk to us are these legendary, amazing people who have accomplished so much with their lives. And, they come in and talk to us for, try to come up with a way to condense a 70-year racing career into an hour-long talk. But, that's such a cool thing that you guys have started doing. I've loved every minute of seeing those guys and getting to meet, legends in the car world.
It's great, because you realize these people really aren't that different than you and I. Al Teague, lived with his mom, most of his life, but he's just so passionate about going fast that he didn't have time for anything else. It was just, work on the car. And these guys, they put on their socks, 1 foot at a time, same as you and I. And, it is kind of a pinch yourself moment when you meet some of your heroes that care about, the history, and they want to help support the museum. But what makes them most excited is that they get to talk to people like you and I that just get excited about what they accomplished. And so we don't see any end to that. We're going to continue doing those talks. We are just on the brink, right before everything kind of changed course on just average everyday life for everyone. We were about to open our automotive fine art gallery here in the museum, and having people like Tom Fritz come and visit, and Daryl Mayhab, and some of these people that you've seen their art in Hot Rod magazine, and you've seen it everywhere, but to have them come here and talk about their careers, and maybe even give a painting demonstration. I mean, we're really trying to broaden the spectrum of what we do as a museum, so when you walk in, it's not just a bunch of dusty relics, but there's actually a life and there's an energy here, and it's harder work to do it that way, but it makes it a much more rewarding experience to the visitor, that's for sure. And Cars and Coffee is just part of that.
So sort of speaking of community, that makes me think of Dave Crane. Do you want to talk about him a little bit?
Yeah, Dave Crane is a really interesting story, and while he's no longer with us, he passed away a few years ago. His story lives on here at the museum. Dave Crane was a postal guy, but he was a postal worker, and just from all accounts, just a really special human being. Loved to have fun, loved to be funny. But I think at the heart of Dave Crane was his passion, very similar to Bill Smith in a lot of ways, where he loved drag racing so much. So he was an early flag man, at some of the early drag races.
Like before they had Christmas trees, he was the guy jumping up and down waving the flag. I mean, that's
exactly. And then he was a tech guy too. So he was, in the tech lanes, teching cars, to make sure they were legal to race. And so as people were breaking things and they were ready to throw them by the wayside, he was the first person to say, "Hey, what you going to do with that?" And there's a great story of a car taking a pass, and the grill shell flew up into the air and went over the fence, and he went and grabbed the grill shell and threw it in his car and left. So he's he's like Bill, where he was he saw the value in a lot of these cool old speed parts, and he amassed a collection of drag racing parts that was really fabulous. Matter of fact, he always dreamed of opening up his own museum, and behind his house he had a large garage, and he'd invite his friends over. People like Al Bergler, that would come over and hang out, and they'd talk about drag racing, and he would show off this collection of early speed parts, including early Edmunds intakes. He had the fuel injection off of the SoCal Coupe when it was running a Cadillac.
Oh, wow.
Back in the day. Just some really rare pieces that you'd never guess were hiding out in a Battle Creek, Michigan garage. So Dave was just super passionate as a collector of drag racing speed parts, and then he passed away, and I was lucky enough to talk to some of his friends when they came through the museum. Rich Martin being the primary fellow, and we became great friends. And he said, Dave's wife's looking for a home for all of Dave's collection of speed parts, and she just wants it all to go to one place rather than getting broken up into pieces. So it was a wonderful situation where I got to know Cora Crane, Dave Crane's wife, Rich, all of Rich's friends, and they became such great supporters of the museum, and we were able to get that whole entire collection, bring it here to the museum, and now we're in the process of creating a display to honor Dave, not only with some of the cars he had in his collection, but also a lot of those speed parts.
And I was just looking at that video that you guys shot when those guys showed up with that Bantam competition coupe, and they were talking about finishing the restoration of the car, but it didn't seem like they really wanted to talk about that. They wanted to talk about Dave and what he meant to them, and how finishing that car was a tribute to him. It wasn't about finishing the car for any kind of glory for them. It was all to sort of honor him and his lifetime of accumulating that stuff and his lifetime of passion for that stuff.
Being involved in cars, and I talk a little bit about having to horse trade all the time to get what you want. You realize the value of certain things. You realize there are a lot of people out in the world that kind of have this vulture tendency to swoop in when something bad happens and take advantage of a situation. As somebody that kind of understands that, I right away thought, oh, so they want to take this car and they want to, now that Dave's gone, I didn't immediately have the feeling that they had the best intentions, but it did not take me long to realize that these guys are the best of the best. I mean, they really cared about Dave, and it was truly, them taking this car, getting it to the point that we could bring it to the Grand National Roadster Show and display it and have people just freak out about it. It was truly for Dave, and that really warms your heart, knowing how much he meant to these guys, and the history in the car are just kind of the side notes. It was just Dave was the focus of that.
You're a relatively young guy. What is it about this history that sort of drew you in and made you more or less devote your life to it?
I've always liked to believe that I'm kind of an old soul anyway. I was born in the late 70s and, kind of lived through the 80s, which were this kind of really cool time. But even in the 80s, when I was a kid, I listened to 50s music, and I really thought I was born in the wrong time. I always looked to the past as maybe a better time. So I loved old toys. I loved cars, obviously. My dad was restoring cars. He was a racer first, but then he was into bringing home every Tri-5 Chevy he could find, because back in those days you could buy a 55 hardtop out of a tree grove for $500, So I grew up kind of in that world, where I'd get to help my dad and hang around these old cars, even if I was just climbing in them. I immediately kind of fell in love with the way things were built and just the world as it was.
So you have obviously a lot of appreciation for what Bill did and why he started collecting and accumulating what he did. How do you want to sort of put your stamp on the place, as it moves forward sort of under your direction? What would you like to leave as your contribution to that legacy?
Boy, that's a tough one. You can never stand toe-to-toe with somebody like Bill Smith. He will always be the king of kings in my mind because he was so far ahead, and he was the impetus for starting and getting the museum really rolling with his collecting and his passion. I am lucky enough to have a fabulous team that helps me. John McKeegan, the previous curator, Clay Smith, and my team of people that help me every day. We're always looking for ways to make the museum more relevant. I think it's important that the museum evolve as people in the car culture evolve. So, you want to make sure that you're placing things in the museum that are important to the folks that are coming to visit. And that's always a moving target. People that lived through the 50s and rode in a 56 Chevy, or maybe they souped one up, they walk by a 56 Chevy Custom in the museum and it means something to them. So as a curator, I guess to answer your question in a succinct way, I always find that it's my job to engage a wider variety of visitors to the museum without also losing your focus on what made the museum so fabulous to start with.
This is going to be a hard question, I can already tell you. If you were to pick a favorite thing in the museum, artifact, car, carburetor, engine, valve cover, you name it, a favorite object in the museum, what would it be?
Boy, object is, if you ask me my favorite thing in the museum, I'd right away tell you my team. Because I love everybody on my team. I love the passion that they have. I love the volunteers, but that's not where you were going. You want to talk about something that's made out of aluminum or steel,
That's a great answer, and you obviously have a much bigger heart than I do. I'm more concerned about, the cast. Give me a cast aluminum thing,
I'm sitting next to a Tucker. There's not much more cool than a Tucker torpedo automobile, and it's in waltz blue. Every single member of the Smith family has had their picture taken by this thing because they're proud of it, and I'm proud of it. I mean, it's a really spectacular car. It's special. Anybody who owns a Tucker or a museum that has possession of a Tucker should feel pretty fortunate. I'm sitting here next to, on the other side of me, is a Bonneville 32 Ford that a guy built who was an HVAC engineer and just a humble guy. And his ashes are in the trunk. And I mean, that's a pretty special car. I met the guy my first year working at the museum when he came through as a visitor. And he said, hey, I've got this 32 Roadster that is my whole world. I've driven it, at all these different locations, chasing speed records. And I'd love for it to be here when I'm gone. And then he died unexpectedly, a year later after I had talked to him and worked with his family and got the car here. So, I mean, how do you not say a car like that's special? I really have a new favorite every week.
Well, you're an old drag racer. I mean, you told me stories about your Plymouth Dodge. What was it that you used to run?
Yeah, I was lucky enough my first car was a 64 Plymouth. And, when you're a young guy that likes old stuff, the first thing you do when you get a 64 Plymouth is you open up Hot Rod Magazine and you find out why they should be cool or what other people have done with 64 Plymouths. And it didn't take me long to kind of, figure out that, there's a whole world wrapped up in those B-body Mopars, acid dip bumpers and aluminum fenders and cross rams and, super stock 413s. And, there's so many cool things. So I decided right away, I don't want this thing to be a 318 push button that I drive to my job at the car wash. I want this thing to melt the tires off the back.
The thing that has always fascinated me about you I counted it up, it's like 13 years that we've known each other, is that every time we have a conversation about cars, you drop I used to have one of those card I mean, things that you would just never even, like the ZR1 Corvette. I'm never going to forget that. You tell me, and I should point out, you and I are the age where a ZR1 Corvette to us is an LT5, C4 vet. It's not a supercharged, whatever it is that they've been in the last 10 years.
Yeah, the monster supercars yeah, exactly. So this would have been the first ZR1 Corvette. Of course, the Lotus built LT5 with the dual overhead cams and front engine, transmission up front. So it was really front heavy. But yeah, I'll be the first to point out, I did not grow up in a wealthy family. I've never really had a ton of money. So if I wanted something cool, I had to learn how to buy, sell, and trade. And, I'd buy something cheap, spruce it up, take all the rat's nests out of it, and then sell it to Joe Schmo down the street. And I'd take that money and buy something else. And, so with enough horse trading and enough energy, I could get what I really wanted. But by doing that, I've had my hands on a lot of different things, as you can imagine.
Well, and that seems to be something that comes up whenever you and I talk. We're both building traditional hot rods, and we're both trying to balance family, work, and trying to be the best employee and dad and husband and everything else that you can be, and still scraping together some time and some money to work on your hot rod. And you seem to be having more success than I do. Do you want to talk about your Model A?
My Model A, it's been a car I've wanted to build a long time, and it got to the point where, being on a kind of a small budget, you just kind of buy parts as you can, or when you find them, or when somebody's nice enough, like when you were so kind to hook me up with my shifter lever. I mean, sometimes, you build a car one piece at a time, 10 minutes at a time. And, luckily I've had a little garage at home I could work in, and that's what I try to do. I try to at least devote some time to it every day.
And you just got to drive that thing. I mean, it's not done by any means, but it was done enough to drive it. I've watched that video that you sent me like 8 times, and every time I feel super happy for you and super excited, and also super like worthless. Like, why is my car still sitting on jack stands in this pile of garbage in the garage, and Tim is out driving his around? But that's pretty exciting.
I decided to build a Roadster because they're somewhat easy. You don't have to worry about a roof. You don't have to worry about a headliner. You don't have to worry about any of that interior stuff, like you would a 55 Chevy. While I do love those things as well. I thought it was a lot of fun. You get to the point where you probably shouldn't drive it on its maiden voyage, but you realize, hey, I'm not going to die if I take this thing around the cul-de-sac. So it was great. It made it down the cul-de-sac in one piece. Nothing fell off. My daughter was with me. She's kind of my number one gearhead at home. So she rode along, and it was a lot of fun, and it's a great feeling. I think anybody out there listening to this who's built a car, when you hear it come to life for the first time, it's kind of this Frankenstein, right? It's like, I did that, I made that happen. And, when it's a collection of parts that are really old, that maybe didn't even have a chance at being a part of a car again, but then you made that work out. And, that's a great feeling.
Do you have any parting words that wisdom that you'd like to impart?
I would just say, to the viewers of this or listeners to this broadcast, that the museum is really here for you. It's a special place that, when you spend your money at Speedway Motors to buy cylinder heads for your 55 Chevy Gasser, some of that comes to this place to give back to the automotive culture, to the hot rod culture, racing culture that not only Bill Smith loves so much, but the Smith family loves so much, and obviously guys like you and I love so much. And the museum is here not because any one person owns it. It's a nonprofit. It's a 501c3. It's an educational space. Bring your kids here. Come on out. Enjoy it. Come back and see it over and over again, because we're always changing things. And really, we make this about you, the visitor, because that's really what's important to us. We want the history to mean something and to be carried forward, so people don't forget just how special it was. It's a huge part of American culture, the car era, what happened in the 50s, 60s, all the way up through today. And so that would be kind of my final statement, is just that the museum's here for you. Come and enjoy it. We'll treat you like family, like VIPs, and if there's something you're interested in, we'll talk your ear off about it. So that's what we're here for.
Thanks to Tim Matthews for being our guest today. And thanks to all of you for listening to What Moves You, a Speedway Motors podcast. Visit the toolbox at speedwaymotors.com for the photos we referenced in today's episode. Email the podcast at podcast@speedwaymotors.com. If you like what you heard, tell a friend where to find us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.